Hello, St. Clare family. I want to share with you a short history of the construction of our church. Because when we finished building the church in 2007, I always had this dream of creating a series of videos that go into the details of what went into the construction of the church, the design and the planning and the prayer. So I decided to create a series of videos about all those details that went into the building of this beautiful church we have here at St. Clare of Assisi, Fallon, Illinois. So I'll start with the year 1997. It was about a year after I became pastor here. And the parish leaders came to me, and we were all recognized that our previous church in downtown O'Fallon was just too small for the growing number of people that were moving into the area. So we had to admit that it wasn't going to continue to sustain our growing parish. And so we started conversations about, well, what happens next when you need a bigger new church? And so we started these conversations with the parishioners at the time. And I remember them being in my house around the dining room table. And we had groups of 12 that would come to my house for a dinner and just open conversation about their thoughts about lack of space and the possibility of a newer or bigger church. And over a couple years, I actually hosted over 300 people in groups of 12 around my dining room table, just listening to what people's thoughts, concerns, fears, and hopes were about the future of St. Clare. So in 2000 then, after a few years of doing that, we got a serious conversation about the need to expand, and then we started having open town hall conversations about these hopes and dreams and kind of the surveys that I had accumulated from all these dinner conversations with our parishioners. So we made it sort of a public, I would say it was the announcement in 2000 that we were going to actively pursue a new church, and we started having conversations with people about whether to expand the old church or build someplace else. So amazingly, God blessed us with a conversation I had with Mr. Louis Rasp in 2001. He donated 20 acres of farmland on the site where our church is now built. And so that was a huge gift from God, and God inspired him to donate that land. So we'll always remember him, and we honor him with a plaque out in our St. Clare Station garden, meditation garden on the other side of the parking lot as well, honoring Mr. Rasp. So after 2001, of course, we started raising funds, capital campaign to take on this endeavor now that we knew we were going to build a church. And from there, we started building what's called a team. When you build a church, it takes a full team. So we started with selecting an architect, BCDM Architects out of Omaha. From there, we started filling out the rest of our team, including the builders, Cordy Construction Company out of Highland, Illinois. And then the other team includes liturgical design consultant Ken Griesemer from Albuquerque, New Mexico, stained glass artist Elizabeth Devereaux from Chico, California, Meltem Aktis from Chicago, originally from Turkey, as well as Demet's Studio from northern Italy in terms of the crucifix as well. So we started putting this team of people together. Oh, well, also the stone quarry from Texas that I'll talk about later. So I'm going to talk about each of those persons later on in the series. But that was the team we created because you want to have a full comprehensive vision of beauty and art, that you're all on the same page in terms of the teachings of Catholic architecture, design elements, and bringing together the traditions of the church in a new building for the 21st century. So that all happened during those years from 97 through 2003. In 2003, I was blessed with being selected to receive a grant to take a sabbatical while we were doing the capital campaign fundraising. We were sort of on a holding pattern, if you will. So I took a sabbatical and had the privileged time of spending time in Rome and throughout other parts of Italy. And my sabbatical had a theme of church architecture and what makes a church beautiful. So I took some courses on church architecture and traditions and history of Catholic architecture and traveled and toured around various parts of Italy. And I just spent lots of quality time in churches praying. And I would walk into a beautiful church, different parts of Europe, and the question that always came that had ruminating throughout my mind or my sabbatical was, what makes a church feel prayerful? What makes the church feel like you're in the presence of God and also has a sense of promotes community. So we just go and sit in a space and kind of took notes and made drawings of what spoke to me about what made a church prayerful. Because that's one of the questions that came from the dinner conversations I had with parishioners, that if we're going to build, we want something beautiful and really looks and feels like a Catholic church. Because during certain decades after the Second Vatican Council, there were a lot of not so inspiring churches built. And so there was some concern from parishioners. So I wanted to make sure we met that tradition and that request from our parishioners and myself, that what makes a church look and feel prayerful and truly lead us to worship of God, because that's the ultimate goal. A church should lead us to give glory to God, like our lives are meant to give glory to God. So I'm going to introduce this, I'm introducing this video series, and I hope it inspires you to get closer to God and get closer to your Catholic faith, and just grow in your knowledge of what really goes into building a Catholic church.
One of the other parts that we took into consideration when we were thinking like big picture design was the history of this land. And for those who know their history, this area was in a sense ruled and lived by all the Native Americans, particularly the Native American Indians that lived in this area. Again, we took into account and respect for those Indians who lived in, as you know, Cahokia Mounds and the Cahokian Indians that lived in this area for about 1,000 years ago, and they're one of the largest Indian populations in the Western Hemisphere. Their land included this area here, so we took that into consideration in terms of the deep surveying we did of the land, respecting if there was any Indian artifacts and so forth. So just really respectful of that, and also we wanted to keep images of them in terms of like building up on this hill. We're up on a hill, representing Clare as light for the Catholic faith for this region, but also up on a hill, kind of reverencing how Indians build places of worship up on hilltops as well, all for the glory of God. So that's kind of just respecting the Native Americans who lived in this area long before us, 1,000+ years ago. The second element I want us to look at while we're out here, outside here, was the influence of this area. Over in that area is where Cahokia is. Not only do we have the Native American Indians, but then following them were the French missionaries who came and settled in Cahokia. And we're blessed here in our diocese. One of the oldest, longest running Catholic church in the United States is right here in Cahokia, Holy Family Catholic Church. The log cabin church is still there from 1799. The parish was founded in 1699. So I wanted to think about that, or keep that in mind, the French history of our area and the Catholic faith in Southern Illinois as well. So in that sense, looking out at where the French first came up the Mississippi River and brought the Catholic faith here, but also wanted to bring some of that French element that I'll point out later in the church, and that is the design of the candlesticks. I found that design, I was visiting and praying at a church in France, that old style of a candlestick, and also if you've ever noticed the fleur-de-lis on the handles of our beautiful doors that we created. I wanted had an artist design those fleur-de-lis to put on the handles, just connecting to our roots with the Native American Indians and the French missionaries who first brought the Catholic faith to our area. What I want to talk about now are some basic elements of what we put into the design ideas. And I'm going to start out with what I'm calling connecting to our past. So when we started talking about the building of the new church, one of the things that came out is people said they wanted it to look and feel like a church. And one of that elements are Gothic arches. There's a long history of Gothic arches, but we wanted to make sure they're in this church through various parts of the aspects, from the ceiling to the stone arches, to even if you look closely at the chandeliers, we designed with sort of a Gothic arch on it. We didn't want to kind of go, Gothic arches everywhere, but we wanted just to kind of have that common theme going through, because people had expressed that was one thing to them that felt like a Catholic church. Now, Gothic arches come from the time period of medieval time, actually, and they grew out of the earlier church architectural style called Romanesque. And Romanesque arches are more rounded, and then during medieval times,
the arches went from Romanesque to Gothic, which is kind of a point. And later on, I'm going to talk about this point representing our prayers rising up to God, all the way from the columns and then the prayers rising up to God. So what was important to us is, because our old church had these Gothic arches in it, that we wanted to bring that part of it here, so it felt somewhat traditional, and yet we also had to address contemporary needs of how to build a church for a large number of people while still having some of these traditional elements that a lot of people associate with Gothic arches that beautifully do represent our prayers kind of rising up to God. The second part of element that you'll see in our church is that we wanted to connect with our Franciscan spirituality. So we developed, and over the years we've been developing more and more kind of this Franciscan spirituality rooted in St. Clare of Assisi, our patroness, who many of you know was, her mentor was St. Francis. And one of the things that Francis and Clare really emphasized was the simplicity of the gospel. And they took on poverty as their friend, or St. Clare called poverty her sister. And so we wanted to make sure that the church had a simple feeling to it as well, with simple colors, just simple elements, so when you walked in, you could really focus on the altar, the crucifix, the tabernacle, the key elements, and not be distracted by a lot of things. So hopefully you'll notice in the warm sort of Franciscan colors and the simplicity, part of our Franciscan spirituality rooted in our patroness, St. Clare. Another element of our design that connects us to St. Clare of Assisi is the stone that we chose for the church. First of all, St. Clare Basilica in Assisi was built in the mid-1200s, shortly after her death and her canonization, and then her body was moved to this new basilica that they built in the mid-1200s. So if you travel to Assisi, you'll notice a common element there is the color of the stone that they're proud of. They call it sort of like a pink stone. And so when we traveled there, we looked at this color of stone and the pattern on the original St. Clare Basilica. And you'll see in it that pinkish tone to the stone, as well as the stripe pattern is also unique to St. Clare Basilica. And you'll see there, like the basilica, the image you see of the original basilica, you'll see here that we wanted to sort of imitate that pattern with two different textures of stone and a little bit of shade difference representing the stripes as well. Just kind of, again, connecting us to that original basilica of St. Clare. Stone, of course, is very dear to my heart, and it's been a part of our Catholic architecture for centuries. And one of the things that stone does, because stone is such a basic element of the earth, God's creation, the oceans and planet Earth, but also stone in terms of worship spaces gives us a sense of permanence, solidity. In our Catholic teachings on church architecture, stone's important because it represents permanence, and permanence represents the faithfulness of God. So when we are surrounded by stone in a church, we give a sense of home and a sense of permanence, that God's faithfulness is always there. So as you come here to worship and surround yourself and feel that stone, which is in our columns and the arches and the walls around us, it helps us connect to God always being there for us and wrapping us in his permanent faithfulness and his love for us.